Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening for everybody who is brave enough to tune in for this space. I am already announcing that it will be a very bloody space and we will have a lot of swearing. I'll try to keep it at the minimum because honestly, there is no point on swearing that much given the subject at hand. However, today we will have a very systematic dismantling of the brand new coup that was served by Michael Koffman over Kursk. Maybe you guys already read his thread. It's beyond pathetic, actually, but that's we're used to it by now. Unfortunately, the Kopmans, the Koplis, the Blackbirds, the retards, the Nafoids have gone beyond what we can probably recover at any given point right now. And, well, there is nothing else to do but either lament it or laugh with it or mock it or any kind of action that would make us feel better, because there is nothing good about the takes that Michael Koffman is entertaining about Kursk. So, first and foremost, Kursk is almost over, not yet. And in the second part of this space, we will speak about the most recent insanity evidence within the bigger OK wave, because honestly, what is going on right now in Belgorod is far more insane than you may think. I know that a couple of pro-Ukrainians have already shown their disdain and absolutely confusion over what's going on right now around Demidovka. They're not alone, to be honest, but like every Ziger would like to have these kinds of operation at least once or twice per month. Why? Well, basically because they are... Demidovka is a special case, by the way. That's why I want to speak that in the second part. But because they are mostly performative at this point. They were a lot more dangerous during the years 22, 23. But since 2024, it's just performance. It has nothing to do... We already spoke about how Ukraine right now is going for the glorification of skirmishes. And you see it on every aspect. The public relation propaganda, call it whatever you want, is extremely prevalent in what they're doing. The recent strike on Engels, probably the ammo dump roughly at the east of the apron, about 2 to 3 kilometers, is the biggest suspect for the explosion. Too far from the airframes, but most importantly, I have a huge problem thinking that they put cruise missiles in the open. But as we've seen a couple of times, especially with UMPKs, Russians sometimes just don't give a fuck. So you have the kind of surprise that we've had a couple of times. Now let's go back to the most important part, which is Koffman's cope about Kursk. And it's extremely funny, because I honestly, people like that, I always thought that would not go this low. I can't expect this from people like, I don't know, Gain Huif or the Astra Intel or whatever. All these parasites and retards, or Dave Demore, or all these people. I'm unfortunately giving them a pulpit here by speaking about them, but you know who they are. They usually go with this absolutely crazy takes on this and that, and then at the end it ends up in tears, generally speaking. But mostly, the more quote-unquote educated or enlightened pro-pigger analysts, they will not give it to the Russians. It's logical. I mean, like, Russia right now is the enemy of humanity, so you can absolutely not hand to them when you're a porcoid. But at some point, you just cannot deny the reality. And the reality, unfortunately, is the amount of losses. And that's the biggest problem that we have right now. That will be the cornerstone of our explanation over this thread that Michael Koffman has executed extremely poorly when it comes to whatever he tried to do there. So, let's delve into the absolute shit show that this thread is. So, first of all, Michael Koffman starts with an update on the war following a recent trip. And I'm like, okay, for fuck's sake. You did a trip until fucking November 2024. You went on another trip. I understand that these guys get paid to fucking write propaganda, but it's absolutely crazy. So, situation compared to fall 2024, I'm like, are you really selling that point? Because in November, it's true that the advance was the greatest on the quote-unquote Ukrainian territory. But November was the first step of what was seen as the stalling of the Kursk salient. And generally speaking, the maximum employment of the Russian advantage and the stretching tactic over the Ukrainian lines. So, at some point, something had to give. On top of it, in November, we had the American election. So, mutatis mutandis, something had to give. Going further in Ukraine, if it was Biden, probably would have kept the Ukrainian foot on the pedal. But because of Trump and because probably there was an afterthought about maybe we can turn around Trump to actually hasten the end of the war, probably the Russians started to dial back and went into this recovery mode, because roughly around the 10th December, we had the Russians starting to counterattack. The 14th, allegedly, we saw the first North Koreans. Of course, still not a solid evident proof that these North Koreans were there, except for probably the fact that we saw Koksans. And also we've seen the M2018 OTA. Generally speaking, in December you see that the Russians are starting to work on the Kursk salient because they do not want to end in whatever negotiation with Ukrops on their soil, at least to such extent that it would allow the Ukrainians to play that game with the bargaining chip. And then the Ukrainians get scared after December, and we have the double frenzy of the attacks. The 6th of January towards Berdin, an absolute shit show, and then the 6th of February towards Kolmakov and Черкасское Поречное, which also ends in tears. And a lot of people were applauding it because, this time it's going to be different. We had even decent Ostenters, I said pro-NATO, of course, but decent Ostenters even biting the bullet and going for this fucking stupidest shit about how the Russians were bypassed and Ukrainians ended in their bags. And then we see now the 11th Brigade, the VDV Brigade, liberating the fuck out of Suja. This is what you need to understand. When it comes to Osin, most of them suffer from Sitrep tunnel vision. And up to 2022, in July 2022, I had it as well. The logic was we were seeing a certain trend and pattern, and we were not thinking about how this trend goes with losses and, generally speaking, with the tactical layout of a strategic goal, generally speaking. And 2022 looked like maybe things were going okay, but slowly signs of cracking were there, not heeded by many. I personally didn't think that Ukrainians would go for Kharkov because Kharkov, as I said, is next to the Russian border. So if the Russians wanted to push back in Kharkov, they would have done it. Unfortunately, we had the logic that the Russians from the beginning were suffering from a manpower situation, and then they needed a electroshock, and that electroshock was initially Kharkov, and then we had Kherson. But Kherson, since, as I said, since the failure in April 26th to actually roll back the whole gains on the Nikolaev Kherson area, and so threatened back Nikolaev. The purpose of the left bank Kherson, so basically Ukrainian side of the Dnieper, as we say that right now, was void, because the few transit spots for the Russians, I think, they controlled at some point 4 passages, 3 being around the Antonov area, so Novakakova, the railroad bridge, and then the Antonovsky bridge. I mean, the famous Antonovsky bridge, who got absolutely pelted by HIMARS all over August, September, October, November 2022. So why am I so angry at Koffman? Well, it's pretty simple, and I'm going to continue the discussion, because I mean, a lot of things are crazy. Are just crazy. This guy has no idea. First of all, we have the quote about stabilization. The situation hasn't stabilized at all. The problem with the so-called stabilization is that you need to analyze it on the cost effectiveness. Have the Russians been stopped on the front line? Yes or no? Unfortunately, even though the gains are extremely small, the Russians are using their favorite salami tactic, which is we push in one direction. If we notice that it's soft, we get through. If it gets hard, then we see what we can do with direction. Either we try to bypass the location, or simply we try to find another soft spot, even 100, 200, 300 kilometers. This is exactly what happened. The Russians, extremely recently, so in March, found a huge gap in the Zaporozhye Oblast, and then took about 55 square kilometers in 3 days. It's the Malysherbak-Kipiataki area. The problem with that area is that it's going to threaten Orikhiv, and if Orikhiv is threatened, then you can see at least another 200, 300 square kilometers gone in a month, if the Ukrainians cannot start to jungle between the Pokrovsk direction, the Zaporozhye direction, and then the others. And this is the greatest advantage the Russians had initially, which is that they could imprint their initiative on multiple areas of the front. On top of it, the issue with the logical front stabilization is completely belied by how the Russian advance is happening since January. So basically, in January, February, we had a average of 300 square kilometers, which compared to January, February, up to May 2024, are way above whatever Russians were doing, and the Russians were throwing a lot of material and men to get that little advance. Of course, they were going through the most fortified area of the Donbass region, and they had some lucky breaks with Ocheretino and with progress and so forth and so on. So the problem with the Ukrainians right now is to tell the truth to themselves. In fact, the Russian advances, based on the cost effectiveness of their operations, are actually better than last year. And I beg you, just go and check. Last year, I said until fucking month of May, the advances in average were about 90 square kilometers. So January, February, March, April, and then you had the push towards Kharkov in May, started 10th of May 2024, which sent everybody into this panic mode in the US and in Ukraine, of course, which was very well exploited by Zelensky in order for the Americans to allow strikes within the Russian territory with American weapons. We know how it went. The Russians basically were hoping to do a little bit more than a small bait, but despite that, they still are holding about 220 square kilometers on the area that they assaulted in May 2024. Whereas, as you've seen more recently, even Deep State puts the current control of the Kursk Oblast from Ukrainian perspective at 80 square kilometers. In reality, it should be around 42 to 45 square kilometers. And with the recent destruction of the Suja gasometer, it's clear that they're fucking left. There is nothing there. What they're going to do is basically what they did since roughly December, which is use the drones to inflict damage to the advancing Russian troops. And that's basically it. And of course, the Saddam Hussein style of blowing up the Suja gasometer, like Saddam blew up the oil wells in Kuwait. I mean, you perfectly understand where the Ukrainian military is right now. And it is not in a good place, and morally, strategically, militarily, Ukrainian military is in absolute disarray. And when the Ukrainians are in disarray, their only panacea has always been to start doing flashy shit. This is not a military that is stabilizing anything. If they try to grab the attention, attacking angles, the blow up in Suja, those are typical vengeance / show-off moments. It doesn't matter if Kirovograd got fucking burned, doesn't matter if Odessa is fucking fired, it doesn't matter if Sumy just got fucking attacked by Shahids, by Iskanders, it doesn't matter if Kryvyi Rog gets blasted. The Ukrainian leadership in the year of 2025 is beyond that. Just listen to them. We have now Zelensky saying, oh, we will never recognize territories that Russians are occupying as Russian. I'm like, nobody fucking asked you anything. You can go and wank yourself. It doesn't really matter. Of course, it's going to be next to impossible for the Russians to have any kind of recognition from the West. The whole point was to avoid getting there. But right now, the Western powers, given that the Americans are trying to have a peace at almost any cost, leaves the Ukrainians in absolute disarray, because whatever the Europeans are yapping about peacekeeping force and everything, it's just not enough. It's not enough in manpower, it's not enough in equipment, it's not enough in sustainment. The only way that can work is if the Americans just go by, but the risk is huge that you're going to have a confrontation within Ukraine, and because Ukraine is a gray area right now, you might have a very, very, very bad problem, very bad situation if the Pindostanis get fucked over there. I have no doubt that if the Brits are going to try and deploy there, for real, we are going to have extremely unpleasant images, because as we've seen with the Russians, they are extremely vindictive right now. So getting Western troops, especially NATO troops, in Ukraine right now for whatever purpose, it's just going to give us what we had with most of the Western weaponry. These guys were promising a fuck ton of money for a Leopard, for a Abrams, for a Bradley, for whatever. Now imagine nailing a deployment point for SAS or whatever bullshit they're gonna fucking start sending there. It's really unfortunate that we have to discuss about this bullshit because it lacks the fundamentals of reflection on the British side. And I understand why they're doing it because they're not gonna. Right now, they don't want to do it for real. But yapping is cheap, and nobody for the moment is pressuring to do anything because it depends first of all on American backing, and American backing works with the Russian acceptance of these guys on the ground, which, as sure as hell, will never happen. The whole point was to avoid NATO, so for sure there is not going to be any peacekeepers, at least within the mandate, in Ukraine. And without mandate, we're going to co-belligerence. If you're going to co-belligerence, you're going to get fucked. Because unless you drop 500,000 European troops, well, you're going to have mishaps anyway. But let's go back to Koffman, because that's the important part here. And our dear friend here continues with Russian advances were stalled for 3 reasons: material exhaustion from losses in the fall, effective Ukrainian adaptation to how Russian forces were prosecuting offensive operations, and winter weather conditions which affected the pace of operations. This dynamic may not hold as we get further into spring. Russian forces appear to be regrouping for new offensive operations. So first of all, the first tweet for the cause of Russian losses is absolute ballooning. The losses on the Russian side since the start of Kursk were actually barely higher than the average. Then they dipped. And this was the funny part. The Russians, with Kursk, basically from August, September, October, November, December, once again, August, September, October, November, December, plus the 2 months up to the 1st of March, so 7 months in total, according to Oryx, of course, were averaging roughly 240 something per month, roughly 3,300 of any kind. A lot of them being drones, a lot of them being transport equipment, engineering shit, but not important. So basically, if you divide by 7, pull a month, you're gonna have more or less what was the situation for the year. So roughly the Russians, by having a full offensive initiative all over 2024, they would have been at roughly 6,000 assets lost. Of course, if we apply the 6 months. And the Ukrainians were at 1,800, more or less. So basically, in the total, we were at about 1.9, 1.8 per 1 loss. So one of the worst ratios already. And the funny part with it is, as I said, wasn't that the Ukrainians were generating more losses on the Russian side. There were very, very little actual extra losses. The problem was that their losses were growing as fuck. And we made the comparison more or less with the duration of the counter in 2023 and here. In average, there was a gap of 17 to 20% between the counter-offensive 2023 and the losses starting from Kursk in 2024. And then expanding to 2025, which leads us to the continuation of our explanation of how Koffman is retarded. Actually, this guy is a moron, but he's a moron because he needs to say shit that makes the Ukrainians feel not so bad for having a retarded military leadership and an even more retarded political leadership. But we can excuse Zelensky because he's probably a coke addict. So, like, imagine Tony Montana in the last quarter of Scarface. Well, that's Zelensky right now. So the first reason that the Russian advance stalled because of material exhaustion. That's arguable. I think, and I will point out, as I said, that it's not the case. But Koffman might believe that, and props to him for actually being able to read tea leaves. Effective Ukrainian adaptation to how Russian forces were prosecuting offensive operations and winter weather conditions, which, well, this is the biggest bullshit, actually. The winter weather operations led to the Russians recovering about 600 square fucking kilometers in Kursk. So in fact, if we add the Kursk operation to the total, we see that the winter did not block the Russians from committing troops and equipment into winter operations. Quite the contrary. The problem is that the whole calculus of the Ukrainians was that one, that to liberate Kursk, the Russians would at some point be forced to relent. The problem with that calculus is that in order for it to work, it would have entailed less Ukrainian losses. And this is the second point, that effective Ukrainian adaptation to how Russian forces were prosecuting offensive operations. This is not the case. The Ukrainians started to lose an atrocious amount of equipment. So their adaptation was actually what we have discussed since December 2024. They literally had to do a ghost counter, a literal stealth counter, in order for the Russians to stall whatever they are claiming right now. But that counter led to epic losses to the point that, and I want to repeat it, to the point that those were the highest losses for a full year, except for the first and second month of this conflict. So basically, a few days in February 2022 and the full month of March 2022. After that, Ukrainian losses are lower than what the Ukrainians have incurred for the Kursk shit show, and we're speaking for the whole front line, just not Kursk, because Kursk, if we need to be honest, is about 850 to 900 assets. For that, you can go and check Sibir's tally, because that's a lot more precise than the bullshit that Gelsia is doing for Kursk. But whatever, it doesn't actually even fucking matter, because the results are there. In Kursk, the results are so obvious that it's the best part of this shit. And for once, I will brag that we said that it would happen like this. The only mistake that I made, because a couple of guys at the group, well, were counting on a longer and more protected defense. I also said that that was the biggest risk, that if you don't flush it quickly, then you will have to fucking grind it. The only thing nobody was expecting is that Ukrainians would be stupid enough to grind it with equipment in Kursk. And based on the losses that we know, even if we take Oryx, Kursk ground to dust about roughly 700 to 900 assets out of the roughly 2,000 that they lost since Kursk started. So between 35 and 45% of the losses were in Kursk. I'm going to repeat, it's very important, because the Kursk salient had the smallest entry gap your breach at the maximum point was 57 kilometers, and then it started to narrow down to the 17 kilometers it was before the situation started to happen with the Russians taking Sredikovo and then crossing the border towards Basovka. And then it was game over. Now they are occupying over 30 square kilometers on the left side of the highway, Yunakivka-Suja. I'm going to add a couple of data over that so you can have a pretty funny moment to say it in that way. So actually, the Ukrainians didn't adapt to anything. What Ukrainians did, unfortunately, and they are still not adapting over 7 months that the Russians have started to fucking kick their asses with optifiber drones. What the Ukrainians did is that they burnt equipment to start and try to stall the Russians. And we are back to over 250 square kilometers per month with the most recent losses around Zaporozhye. So the logic is pretty simple. Koffman is lying through his teeth, and my problem is that he knows it. He probably knows that he's lying. But he just cannot go out and say, okay, the Ukrainians are stupid and what they're doing is just wasting equipment. Now, he is very smart sometimes. He said, this dynamic may not hold as we get further into the spring. And I'm like, how is that even possible? Why would this dynamic not hold if you know how to counter the Russians? Actually, it should get worse because if the Russians are always suffering from equipment shortages, the fact that you know how to fight against them is just going to make that thing worse. It's exactly what happened to the Kursk grouping. They were pushed on the corner, and then they lost their two main supply lines, and that was it. They just got the fuck out. In a certain sense, it was a mini Kharkov. And the problem with that is the losses were almost the same as fucking Kharkov for the Ukrainians. And the other issue, though, is that once analyzed properly, Kursk still had about 600, 700 losses. Okay, it's the way our Oryx calculates them. Some of the equipment is absolutely bullshit. Like excavators and transport, they have a lot less value. They even added singular ponton links, so I mean, Oryx bullshit, doesn't really matter, but it still cost the Russians about 100 assets a month. Now those 100 assets, as I said, would have probably also been used in a better way along the Donbass area. So it's not a free lunch either for the Russians. However, what it does for the Russians right now is a huge boost on morale. And we're going to read a bit under what Koffman is saying about that. But so generally speaking, once we see the numbers, material exhaustion, not really actually. Effective Ukrainian adaptation, not really. And finally, winter conditions, not really. Actually, the only thing that helped the Ukrainians stall on the Pokrovsk area is Kursk in a certain sense. So that point is valid. Because the Russians decided to clear up Kursk for probably political reasons, they dialed back the Pokrovsk situation. Not the damages inflicted to the Ukrops, because that's the thing, that's one of the things that has changed a lot in this war, especially in end of 2024 and now in 2025. The Russians are a lot more proactive and a lot more efficient when they neutralize an area. When they stop attacking, it allows their own drone teams, especially now with the optifiber drones, to just wreak havoc to absolutely everything. Hidden equipment, equipment in battery, hiding spots, concealed deployment points. In a certain sense, it's the Russians who have actually adapted to the Ukrainians, not the contrary. Ukrainians are doing the same bullshit with drones they've done since the 10th of October 2023. You remember those swarms, the massive losses the Russians took for about 2 months in the Avdiivka salient, and then it didn't even went better, but they tried to cut down on the losses. And the reality is pretty simple. It's the Russians who are adapting right now. If you guys saw, now we have Shahids with a electro-optical warhead. This is something that we were expecting since 2023. Okay, we saw images of that a bit earlier in 2024, but still almost 2 years after. So the Russians are slowly getting there. And the problem with this situation is that if the Russians start having a flexibility in their weapons and their assets, then you will have something of a huge problem for the Ukrainians. And in a certain sense, the optifiber boom, bonanza, is there to underscore how much of a problem the Ukrainians have right now. If the Russians are not the stupid assholes that they were allegedly in 2023, 2022, what is there to expect for the Ukrainians? Because as I said, the only thing the Russians need to do at every single spot is just to level the playing field. The moment they're leveling the playing field, we're going to have what happened the last 3 weeks in the front line. The last 3 weeks, for the first time since a while, since basically the beginning of Kursk, the Ukrainian losses were bigger than the Russian ones. Actually, by even a bigger margin that fucking Yakubianovsky tried to sell us, because they added drones. Okay, those are losses. We're not discussing it. But they are trying now to put pickups, because allegedly they were made for the Russian military. But we can prove that at least 150 pickups were ordered by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, and they were delivered in different batches from different brands. One of those brands is extremely specific. Those are MG, so it's a Chinese manufacturer. MG pickups. At least 7 of them have been seen through Russian drone first-person cameras. Should we add those as well? I mean, the whole logic of losses that initially was purely military and specific equipment now is going to this weaseling just to try and equalize the Ukrainian losses somehow. And this is something I actually told the guys in the group at some point. They are not updating because it's a fucking shit show. They're getting the shit pushed in Kursk, but not only in Kursk. We are at some point right now, if you check Sibir's tally and if you check the footage day after day, that 2 tanks a day is a normal day for the Ukrainians right now. I'm going to tell you that the maximum that I had lost, according to Oryx, was 440 the first year. And the 2 follow-up years, they had never gone over 300. Okay, Oryx withhold a lot of losses and spread them out, but now they cannot hide. Now in 2 months, in like 70 days, we're looking at over 120 tanks from Oryx themselves. If we check our own account, like we are going over 200 and something tanks based on footage once again. And this is the main issue that we're having right now. This is why people like Koffman are completely deaf-toned, because they are denying a reality we can touch, we can see, and the Russians are making a good PR out of it. And it's extremely important once again, because that's one of the worst parts of the Russian military's record right now. Their PR sometimes is absolutely dog shit, and sometimes actually most of the time. Then Koffman keeps going. The AFU is successfully attracting Russian forces at 0 to 30 kilometers through a combination of mining, drones, traditional fires. I'm like, bro, have you seen the tally? Do you see the fucking scoreboard? The scoreboard is so fucking bad for the Ukrainians that every single one who has gone through the thread of Yakub the Fagot or Nalsio is crying. Pro-Ukrainians, of course. Us Ziggers are crying out of laughter, but that's something else. Everybody's saying, even Tata the Gay made the fucking Substack when he literally says, oh my god, the ratio is bad for us. Yeah, bitch, that was the whole point, you dumbass. And this dude was the first to actually applaud Kursk. Oh, it gave us back our fucking whatever. Yeah, actually, that's why you're getting back 750 every fucking month. Every fucking month, Ukrainians are getting 750. Dead assholes. And once you start checking the database for Kursk idiots who died, you are between 7,000 and 9,000 killed and missing in action. More probably, at least 10,000 killed and missing in action, and at least 10 other thousand wounded. The problem with those losses is, in a certain sense, they are not that big. Let's be honest. Donetsk is still taking the lion's share. But the problem with that is that those guys died in vain. Because there is nothing that happened in Kursk that can justify those losses. Now, there is a bigger insanity they're committing right now, but this is going to be a part of the second rant over the situation. But the Ukrainians are stuck. Their leadership is in this fucking stasis where the only thing they can do or they can think about is trying to divert the attention of everyone from the course of the war. Remember, everybody sold Drapati as this and that. Fucking check the geolocations right now. Geolocations right now are showing that whatever gain was had in Lisovka, in Shevchenko, in Kotline, in Pesanoe, every fucking single advance is being pulled away from them. In Shevchenko, you can already see with geolocation, the Russians have repelled them completely outside of the fucking city. In Pesanoe, the Ukrainians, for some fucking reason, deep state in this case, for some fucking reason, is trying hard to annoy geolocated situations that see the Russians having completely put the western part of the area into the gray zone, at least. Not to say they have cleared out the full crops. But it's fine. Nobody fucking cares because this is the problem that the Ukrainians are facing. And that problem, as I said, was the Sisyphus paradigm. This is something I explained roughly around 2023 in the era of the counter. And if you know, the Sisyphus myth is basically the guy was a smartass and he had slighted multiple gods, including Zeus, by trying to actually oversmart them and con them. And as a punishment, finally, Zeus put this asshole to push a boulder over a steep hill, let's say it like that. And every time what would happen is that the hill would get so steep that Sisyphus could not push the boulder up and he would just move away from it. The boulder would come back. And this repetitive, never-ending task was his basically punishment for trying to be a fucking smartass. Now, why Sisyphus for the Ukrainian forces or for the Russians? Because it applies to both, actually. Well, the bolder in this case is the losses when you are defending more passively. So you're waiting for the Russians. They're exposed. You can hit them. Drones, artillery, missiles, whatever. But then you need to reconquer the spots they own, they have under control. And at that point, the shoe is in the other foot. And this is the boulder coming back to Sisyphus. So you pushed it up, but you cannot push it anymore. So it's going to come and fucking run over you. And that's what Ukrainians tried to do for now 3 months stealthily and pretending everything was fine. They were just defending. It's not true. They were counterattacking. I already proved this by the losses. I already proved them by the way the general movement was there. We can even start looking at why the Ukrainians are so close with their artillery. And of course it is to be able to strike deeper and so to cover by artillery whatever grouping that's going to go and take, I don't know, Shevchenko, Kotlino, Persanoa, and so forth and so on. And the problem with this Sisyphus paradigm is that the boulder, when it comes to the Ukrainian side, is twice or thrice bigger. What do I mean by this? Ukrainians have less assets, less men, and this makes it easier for the Russians, especially now they're using optical fiber, which so far have no real counter. It makes it easier for the Russians to counter the Ukrainians. Why? Because Ukrainians have less equipment. So where the Russians are going to fucking drive down a small village with 15, 16 assets, Ukrainians are going to do that with 3, 4, or 5. The Ukrainians are going to use 50, 60, 100 FPVs, most of them being wireless, so susceptible to electronic warfare on the Russian side. The Russians are going to see 5, 6 assholes on their Western tin cans, and they have FPVs that are almost impossible to jam, or counter, or see, because there is no ammunition. So the Russians are going to use less actual assets to hit the few assets the Ukrainians are going to use to try and counterattack. So the efficiency on the Russian side is aided by the lack of equipment and lack of manpower on the Ukrainian side. And this is where the things get extremely tricky when you hear Koffman say, oh yeah, attrition is working great. Russians are relenting. In reality, the Russians know exactly what they're doing. They probably would like to have taken Kursk as it is. But in reality, Ukrainians getting out of the city and trying to counter around the Solona river line is an absolute win-win situation. Ukrainians get fried salo, they like that shit, and the Russians get kills. It's fine. And this attrition actually is worsening the general defense of the Ukrainian front. And that's why you have the guys pushing in the Dvorishna area, crossing this is, I think, is the 5th crossing over the Oskil / Oskol. In Chastov Yar, people say nothing is moving. I'm like, I'm not that sure that nothing is moving Chastov. Actually, there is no pushback. In Toretsk, everybody was applauding the counteroffensive, and then now we are seeing that by geolocation, the Russians are actually going back at it and literally thrashing the Ukrainians. This is why the analysis, as I said, should try to avoid the Sitrep tunnel. And suddenly, on the Toretsk axis, we've had the first movement along the highway west of Toretsk in almost a year. We've had other movements around Kudmirovka, and we have had movements on the Russian side north of Chasov. So slowly, the Drapati effect is just going out. People like Koffman are going to recognize it probably in about a month or so. And if you check the deep state map, check for inner salients on the Ukrainian side, you're going to see at least 6 of them. If we are purely on a performative mode, if the Russians are like that, they have 6 salients to close, and it would give the impression that they are gaining more ground, whereas actually they are just liquidating the salients. But it's still, we're speaking about over 500 square kilometers. The reality is that now the Russians are investing a lot of attention to try and have the Ukrainians once again commit somewhere in defense. Right now they had committed in Pokrovsk, and that allowed them to push in Zaporozhye and other areas, but mostly in Zaporozhye. That was the most obvious push and the most important and dangerous push for the Ukrainians, because they risk losing Orikov or Orikiv in their fucking language. And that's why the follow-up from Koffman is absolutely ridiculous. But it doesn't really matter. I mean, like, I don't really care with these people. Russian units often do not reach defensive position, and much of the equipment is lost in assault. And I'm like, bitch, what the fuck are you even talking about? The problem is that most of these assaults succeed, which forces Ukrainians to start counterattacks, because the biggest problem the Ukrainians have right now is that the small beachhead of the Solona River became bigger, and right now they cannot dislodge it. Having that foothold beyond the Solona River means that if the Russians now press there, you might have an infiltration west of Pokrovsk, going northwest, and cutting most of the roads coming in the city. Because the actual supply line for Pokrovsk doesn't come from north. It comes either from west or northwest. If they want to go over north, then you have a bigger problem, bigger detour, more time lost. And of course, as I said, it changed a lot within the defensive plan from the Pokrovsk grouping. And this is the fun part, that I'm pretty sure Koffman understands that. He just cannot say it. I hope it's not the case. I rather have him lie and be a propagandist that be stupid and don't understand the point. Now, Ukraine invested this approach last year by significantly expanding drone units such as Birds of Magyar. I'm like, bitch, compare what Birds of Magyar are posting to a monthly basis compared to what Birds of Magyar was posting in Krinky last year, motherfucker. Just go and check it. I have no fear of pointing that out. They had a huge, wonderful geolocation there, and they could literally call the Russians trying to push them out. In Pokrovsk, the claimed destruction has been halved, and then we can maybe talk about the Russians not having assets. But the reality is just dispersal. It has nothing to do with not having the assets. It has to do with them not fucking losing as many assets because they need them for something else. That something else is coming. Because Kursk ended. And that something else is gonna happen because Trump and Vova are gonna find a solution. Not palatable for either parties, let's be honest. There are gonna be concessions, but as I see it right now, not nearly as many as what Ukrainians could have had even a year ago. I'm not even speaking about Istanbul end of March 2022. I'm saying even a year ago, the Russians would have probably settled for less. But right now, it's another war, as I said. And I'll have it also invested in scaling up mine and drone production. I'm like, I don't really see how you can say that. Look at what happened in Kursk. Look at the type of mining that happened in Kursk. Most of the mines were either sourced from abroad or were completely foreign equipment. And when I say sourced from abroad, I'm speaking of Soviet legacy mines, a lot of Czech mines, a lot of Bulgarian mines. And then shit from NATO, a lot of Italian and French mines were seen in Kursk. Drones are responsible for over 60% of the daily Russian Federation casualties at this point. It's just the same for the Ukrainians, unfortunately. Although we've seen that the Russians like also doing a bit of a pew-pew after capture, which is completely normal in Kursk, especially because Kursk is a counter-terrorist zone. It's at the discretion of the arresting authority to allow the perps to survive or not, especially as the perps have access to lethal weaponry. But generally speaking, what Koffman is selling to us is just bull. When you see how Suja crumbled, thanks to a special sewer operation, yet another one that they claim that had defeated, because this is the funny part. That's where the Ukrainians are lying, and Koffman doesn't even fucking flinch. Okay, yeah, whatever, they lied. What's the point? It's normal, they're Ukrainians. Or it's normal, they're defending themselves. They're like, bro, once you start lying, it's a slippery slope. You can lie because you don't want to, deface the defending side. But if you start lying for bullshit that we're hearing, then what you're going to do is completely destroy the fundament of any military group, which is, quote unquote, keeping it real. That's why a military unit is a lot of guys who are bitching and screaming and absolutely being unbearable for the slightest or the biggest thing. And I can recall the 4 guys we were in the fucking Chinese tank, or the 48 guys that we were on the fucking company. If the guys were happy, there was a fucking problem. It was not possible. And now suddenly Ukrainians are doing just fucking fine, man. Like, wow, it's so good that we haven't recaptured any single village on the Kursk salient. 0. Even the made up shit from Deep State over the Sovka, over Shevchenko, nothing, none. So how the fuck is Drapati doing anything with his bullshit for 3 months? Wasting huge amounts of equipment and people. Scala, if you can see their missing in action chats, it's just beautiful. Just beautiful. So this is the problem we're having. I spoke about Ukraine being in this fucking post-truth situation where they're absolutely gonna flip everything around and say it's absolute greatest victory ever. Zelensky just did that with Kursk. Kursk is an abomination. Militarily speaking, is such a fucking spanking. But the most important part is that even the justification of, Kursk allowed for the Ukrainians to use Western weapons in Russian territory doesn't hold any true. When was the actual last time the Ukrainians used a mass salvo of anything? I know when. 4 or 5 days ago, trying to target fucking Kokstans and missing entirely. But they made a little bit of a note there, like, Zincheno destroyed. And I'm like, bitch, you just peppered a whole area around them, and after the impact, there was no smoke, there was no deflagration, there was not even fucking propellant burning. And let's hope that you somehow damage the barrels. Because for the rest, the Kokstans are on a fucking T-55, 54, 55 chassis, so they're kind of armored. And that's the funny part with this shitty situation when it comes to the Ukraine side. They started to outpost so hard. I'm like, God damn it. I mean, like, situation is bad, but you don't need to humiliate yourself like this. But Koffman actually disagrees. He wants to, like, keep going. Drones continue to expand their role as counter to other types of drones. There is a growing role for UGVs, logistical role as part of breaching operations. Actual automation is slowly coming along with terminal guidance, include turrets and so. Like, include turrets. What the fuck are you even talking about? The UGVs that we're seeing on both sides are unicorns. We're speaking about 10 to 50 units for over 200,000 people on both sides of the fucking contact line. What the actual fuck is this? This is the biggest problem we're having here. We have a grown-ass man speaking about something that, except for the air, has yet to pan to anything else. And it's true that Ukrainians are using Magur as launching pads for drones, and we had a footage of half-fast attempts to hit Russian equipment in Crimea. But that was completely erased, with the Russians literally showing Iran with an electro-optical warhead hitting a rail echelon. Then what the fuck are you even talking about? We're going back to the same paradigm that we had before. Ukrainians have like a flurry of drones. Russians come there with a Shahid, and they just like do a T-34 with it. Big turret, small turret, big payload, small payload, electro-optical payload, electronic warfare payload, whatever. Just fucking do it. And there is exactly what I told you guys. There you see the strategic approach from one side to the other. And sometimes it leads to mistakes. Like, for a lot of time, Russians did not have a out-of-the-box FPV quality drone. And everybody was yapping about pseudoplatov and shit like that. And then suddenly we had the OptiFiber drones coming by, and Sudo had to do their own. Nobody's complaining about anything else. And that's the biggest issue with the situation. Because a lot of fat asses, they didn't want to, refine themselves those drones. Like the Ukrainians actually are doing. Sergei Flash just literally said that Ukrainians are still forced to adapt because certain critical components are not produced in Ukraine, contrary to the Russians. But of course, people listen to only what they want to listen. And it's true for everyone, including us. But the situation with one side against the other is that one side is producing a floppy of bullshit, which impedes large serialization. And on top of it, it's not even fully financed. Just go to Sternenko, go to Gedyar, go to all these assholes. They're all asking for donations. But it's not the same kind of donation as the Russians. No, what they're asking is literally to live and make some money and produce more. Now, how the fuck comes that a couple of the best units within the Ukrainian armed forces are literally asking for donations for FPV frames, something that allegedly Ukraine has sold for now 2 years. And of course you're going to say you can never have enough. I understand. But the numbers that Zelensky is peddling should not make it a problem for these guys to have their own stash. Dude is speaking about over 1.5 million in 2024. I'm like, okay, whatever. I mean, like, probably that was the Coke talking, but same for Koffman saying that Ukraine right now produces everything that they need on a day-to-day basis. Then what the fuck do they need if they have everything on a day-to-day basis? Reality is quite the contrary. Ukraine just doesn't have it. If you check one of the pictures, and of course it's anecdotal, so there is a criticism to there. One of the pictures of captured rifles, machine guns, sniper rifles, whatever, in Kursk, you could see that out of the 33 weapons, automatic weapons or semi-automatic weapons you had there, 19 were NATO. A lot of Henels, 2 Scar Ls, Mark IIs, by the way, so basically straight up from the FNR style stock. There were 3 mini-me's slash M249s. There were 2 mags or slash M24s. Once you see this shit, you're like, okay, how the hell? First of all, you realize that the units that got schwacked in Kursk weren't your average terabobs. We were speaking about, well, VDV, paratroopers and stuff like that. But the most important part is not even that. The most important part is that why the fuck are we having less war-packed weapons for the Ukrainians? Of course, we can always say that, oh, but well, basically it's better to have Stanag because this and that. But the reality is, in my opinion, far simpler. The lack of equipment is affecting IMO both, but Ukrainians are not the best, and not having the best moment out of the two. And that situation is exactly where we're going at. Ukraine just doesn't have what it needs to fight day by day. If you get out of okay, maybe it's not a significant pool to analyze the Ukrainian armed forces, but more recently we learned that the Ukrainians want to license, or they reached an agreement with Bren for licensing the Bren 2. Says it actually, just Kazbroika. For the Bren 2, and I like, okay, fine, but why would you do that? Why would you assemble a rifle built abroad? And of course, you're gonna say, okay, there is a war, it's not safe. For such production, you need larger units, which means that they're gonna get spotted, they're gonna get bombed. And then, of course, the problem that we're seeing here is that Ukraine still has to receive a fuck ton of equipment, weapons, and ammunition. The AU commissioners said that they're gonna receive 2 million rounds in 2025. I'm like, based on what was said before, based on the orders, and based on how the market is gonna go, if they get 1.5, it would be actually pretty nice. And of course, most of it would be procured abroad. What kind of quality we'll see, that's something completely different. But just to say that the situation of the Ukrainian military is almost dramatically and drastically at the opposite of what Koffman is trying to sell here. And he said, like, Ukraine is now making much of what it needs for day-to-day combat needs, from mines to drones, but it remains dependent on the West for long precision strikes. Like, bro, if they could make what they need propellant-wise, we wouldn't fucking find them with a full-decked M777 Lotto Bingo position with no fucking charges. There were no propellant in most of these positions. They had a fuck ton of rounds. I only saw the pictures a week ago. There were no charges. And that's it. That's that. On top of it, the problem with the Ukrainian military right now, it is that it's burning through everything. Before we had this logic, okay, they are burning through the Soviet stock because they're going to receive European stock. But look at the loss of the Bogdana, which is supposed to be kind of on par with the Caesar. And then you're like, what the fuck? This is your most modern SPH or SPG, and it's getting clapped by fucking optifiber drones because you put it between 8 and 13 kilometers from contact line, and therefore it gets raped. Because now what the Russians are more and more using, it has gone to 50 to 60%, is coils of 20 kilometers. And now the Russian manufacturers of optifiber coils are offering duplex at 30 kilometers. Okay, it's mostly for Russian quote-unquote Baba Yagas, but who the fuck cares? Just latch that stuff on a normal FPV, and voila, you got the 30 kilometer duplex optifiber FPV. Which gives us destroyed Uragan, destroyed Panzer Haubitze 2000, Caesar, Bogdana, Ace-90, a flurry of M109, and of course the usual grandfathers from the Soviet army, a lot of Godzikas, Akatsias. So the whole point that Koffman is trying to make not only sounds hollow, but right now I said, okay, I had a lot of respect for these guys, but here we're just going to cope mode. So he's trying to deserve his Michael Koffman moniker. And Ukraine received significant amounts of artillery, ammunition, equipment over the winter, and increased its own production of drones across most. Like, what ammunition did it receive actually? As I pointed out, the problem is that Ukraine received ammunition with too low of a range, not enough propellant charges. It was forced to use bags instead of max. And a lot of these bags were of the shorter type. So basically, they would fire between 11 and 17 kilometers with a different barrel. For instance, if used on a crab, it would go at 19. But in order to be able to execute what you need to execute with your artillery, which is, as I said, you put it more or less at half the distance, you can outshoot from the contact line. So if your max range is 19 kilometers, you're gonna try and get at 9.5, so you can cover deeper. Behind the contact line. We've seen Ukrainians with a fucking crab being at 6 kilometers. Like, don't you like your life, bitch? Why you wanna die? We had this prophecy with GAMS when we saw like Slovak bag max 18 kilometers gonna get clapped by optifiber. 2 weeks after, at least one such carcass. Magic, right? That's why artillery exists, is to have this stiff arm on a distance. But if your artillery doesn't have that stiff arms, this range, this separation, you're just fucked. In a certain sense, it's better to have your tanks firing at 4 kilometers because they are better protected. And you can be a bit more mobile than be at 9-10 kilometers with your tin can with a big gun full of charges and full of ammo and end up like most of the shit we're seeing from both sides, but especially from Ukraine. And this attrition has a huge impact on what Europeans can give. And then we have the only thing that I hated, I even made a thread over this, criticizing Tata the Gay. You do not want to start lionizing one general or the other, because this war is a very jading war. It has gone into attrition mode, and for one exuberant action, for instance, the Super Zigro Bro attack, you're gonna have a dozen of attempts to occupy a fucking tree line, as we saw right now in Demidov from the Ukrainians with ATVs, or in Pokrovsk from the Russians with the same ATVs, ending in killed and maimed and wounded. So if you start lionizing a figurehead like Drapati in this case, and then you start to see his fucking production compared to Sirsky and Bahmut in 2023, I'm sorry, but Drapati is a big dick and has 2 balls for brains. He's not doing any good to the Ukrainian defenses. And lionizing this guy within 1 or 2 months is bound to absolutely backfire if there is no ceasefire. Mark my words. And then he speaks about Japat taking over land forces, and also, of course, this has had positive effects on morale units. I don't think that when I see the Scala assholes being skewered by Mobiks in fucking Shevchenko, I'd say that. Same thing for the mothers and the daughters and the wives of these assholes crying over forums. Notice this happens on the other side as well. But Russian soldiers bitch and piss over the commandment, but they still obey. How they do it is something else. Ukrainians are forced to sell the fact that Drapati is such a fucking great leader that he actually hasn't managed to keep alive his 20-something square kilometer we captured according to Cope State. And he's losing the most difficult pockets to lose, actually. If he completely loses Shevchenko and Peshanoe, he's handicapping the defense forces of Pokrovsk to the T. His attempt to undercut the bridgehead beyond Solone, which would have yielded maximum 50 square kilometers, now it's such a bad place because the Russians have counterattacked, and the Russians are doing something that I always said. They experimented in Kursk with how to choke the logistical footprint with the optifiber FPVs, and they are applying it almost everywhere now. And it's normal. There is no electronic warfare to counter it. So it has become a hammer, and so every problem is a nail now. We had the same discussion over the UMPKs last year. UMPKs are still there, by the way. Big up to fighter boomer who keeps saying bullshit, but anyway, it doesn't matter. And then training reform is finally being tackled, and there are prospects for change on the new land force commander, improving quality of training. I'm like, how the fuck are you going to improve the quality of training when you literally lost 55 square kilometers of Zaporozhye, which would mean that you need to grab whoever you fucking have and go and try and stop that before you lose Orikhiv, of course. Improving quality of training facilities, updating content, replacing structures, and tying training to actual combat needs. The problem is that most of the guys that Ukrainians are getting right now are not volunteers. So you need to beat the shit out of them, figuratively and in reality. And then you have a structural deficit of manpower continues to be Ukraine's leading problem. That's not true. The biggest problem we're having right now is that Ukrainians are starting to have a staggering deficit of assets. Hence, what they're trying to do right now in Belgorod, which is the same thing that we're laughing at the Russians for. Light assets with a couple of guys on them trying to infiltrate. Meet waves, quote unquote. Ukraine has thankfully suspended creating new brigades, reversing what was one of the more puzzling force management choices in 2024. Well, the problem is that the new brigades were puzzling choice because they were not meeting the fucking mobilization numbers in order to sustain those new fucking brigades. So in reality, what you want to say is that Ukraine has a problem with mobilization. They cannot find enough people for those new brigades. And therefore, what they're going to say that, oh, we're going to reinforce the existing brigades. So basically, putting a cap on how much people the Ukrainians are going to have. And that's what it is. There is nothing more to say here. And trying to speak that, oh, we need a better... Nah! That makes no sense. As I said, Smertnik from Skala died by the fucking dozen. They are still grabbing people, putting them together and sending them to assault. It's not a matter of training, but it's a matter of self-conscience in this case. And as long as I can see, the Ukrainians have completely lost it. In recent months, Russian forces have not advanced significantly near Pokrovsk, Chasiv, Kupiansk. Most of the Russian progress has been around Velika Novosibirsk. This is not true, my friend. Actually, in recent months, Russians closed the Kurakovo pocket, which gave them an extra 120 square kilometers. Yes, of course. The Kurakovo pocket, well, is in between Pokrovsk and Ugledar. But the reality is that the pocket itself had been gained. It was a matter of time to finish it. In a certain sense, it was kind of a start padding when it came to the area to occupy or liberate in this case. Kurakovo and Kursk. However, in Kursk, the AFU has been forced to withdraw from most of the territory held. Recent Russian advances in Kursk were taking place well before the special US military assistance intelligence. The battlefield geometry of a salient was inherently unfavorable. I'm like, is this nigger serious? Russian forces chipped away at Kursk until they could interdict the few supply routes. No, Russian forces already interdicted the supply route. It's the Ukrainians that sent fucking Smertniks to try and resupply the guys in there. And the problem, we explained this, is that Kursk, since roughly December, did not have a continuous line for both sides, but the side who was defending was the Ukrainian side. That meant that you had plotted defenses that once you overcame one or two plots, you had a wide enough gap to push people on their backs or their rears. Big up to the Polish idiot who actually tried to contend whatever he tried to, because he's not even a bad guy, but sometimes being pro-Ukrainian makes you more retarded than you might be. And then he starts with the TWK assaults, like, once again, please evidence that there were these thousands of fucking Koreans that disappeared at will. But the core problem was logistics as Russian fiber optic FPVs, drones, security, interdicted supply routes. Actually, that's not the fucking problem. The fucking problem initially is that the optic fiber started to chip away at the staying power, artillery, tanks, AVs. And the problem that once they started to clean them up, then they waited for the logistic issues to pile up. Once you lose 5-6 tanks, you need to bring those 5-6 tanks, or at least half of them, to replace in order to offer your defenders a chance. Guess what? When you try to go there, remember the couple of heavy trailers that we saw taken out all over the road from Pisarevka to Suja? Well, that's your logistical issue. In order to have a logistical issue, you first have a force issue. You are losing shit up front that you need to replace and sustain. And how does that happen? By getting pressured up front. And in order to counter that pressure, Ukrainians were replying with artillery from within the salient, which would get taken out by Ukrainian stupidity and Russian optical fiber drones, which meant that once that support base, that fire base, was gone, remember we spoke about this in one of the earlier spaces about how to manage your fire base. Well, Ukrainians haven't still learned in about 3 years. Russians are barely better, by the way. So once you start losing your fire base, you're going to start to rely on something we've seen the last 3 years from both sides, but especially from Ukrainians, tanks being used as artillery. Those tanks being used as artillery are easy to pop out because you need to have those tanks stay for longer periods on specific pontoons. And on top of it, the Ukrainians were on defensive posture since roughly October 2024, even earlier, but I will not start that discussion. So, by the moment you have this situation, the Ukrainians are not fucked because of the logistical routes. That plays, of course, but in order to target the logistics, you need first to take out the force, the core of the situation. Because that's when you overload the package. Having less ammo for more guns is one thing, but having no guns, you need to replace and then put the ammo on top of it. That makes the whole challenge almost impossible to actually get fixed. Now, unfortunately, there will be significant equipment losses due to the withdrawal. I do not think that the withdrawal will yield these significant equipment losses. It will just once again pad the stats of what things were already lost. If you check Gelsio once again until the 1st of March, you understand that the most that would be added is maybe 200 extra losses from that perspective, but the 600 were already gone. So the only thing that you're gonna get is the ignominious end that Kursk already had stamped on his forehead. So there is no logic on trying to sell lipstick for the fat pig that Kursk was initially. Now that's the funny part, because Kursk initially was a wider operation with distractions and false cues. We will speak about this in a couple of minutes. So, given the character of the fighting, territory changing hands is a lag indicator of what's happening between the two forces. I agree with that. If we check to the losses, I do not think that you would like to tell me how the fight is going, but consequently, gradually, then suddenly, transitions are going to be common when a set of positions become unsustainable. Yep, that's exactly what the problem is. In my view, holding Kursk wasn't doing much for Ukraine at this point. At this point, when did it do anything for Ukraine? Trading it for something seemed an unlikely proposition. The offensive did not lead to a change in the overall dynamic in the war or a large shift of the air forces, the Russian Federation forces from Kursk to Kharkov axis. You just fucking made a fucking bloody thread over how Kursk, yada yada, Drapati, yada yada, everything yada yada better. Yet Kursk is not justified by anything. Like, how does it even fucking work? I retain an overall mixed view of Kursk offensive and think it would have been best as a 1-2 week raid. I'm like, okay, you're gonna do a 1-2 week raid. Do you actually know how much equipment did the 1-2 early week raid cost to the Ukrainians? About 150 pieces of equipment. There literally needed to be a lull between October and December to not break the 1,000 assets lost over the 7 months. So I don't really understand how Koffman is going to tell us that, oh yeah, 1 or 2 weeks would have been fine. Actually, it wasn't the case at all. And that's what you know. That's how you know, actually, that the Ukrainians were not preparing some kind of small raid. What they wanted was to frighten the Russians enough to pull more troops. But the point is that if you're going to do a 1-2 week raid, the kind of equipment you need to bring there was going to be extremely redundant. I mean, these guys lost over 700 pieces of equipment. Okay, over 7 months for sure, but that means that they needed to have the 700 on a rotation basis. And given how the Ukrainian brigades are shaped up, especially since the counter era, that means that they wasted about 1 brigade a month in assets. Which is very funny. It's the funniest part ever. So when Koffman tries to tell us and sell us bullshit like 1 or 2 weeks, I'm like, okay, so you would have savaged roughly a brigade and a half, given how the losses were after 1 or 2 weeks, and do what with it? If you weren't to hold the territory that you had, remember that Syrskyi sold the logic that they were holding 1,200 square kilometers. I disputed that, but who the fuck cares? I mean, I'm nobody. Syrskyi is our best partner in THD, so we have to listen to dude. So you have 1,200 square kilometers. How are you going to cover them if your whole point is to be a raid and therefore not have the manpower or the equipment to control it? So what? You're going to just push to Korenovo and then go back? That would have been worse than pointless, especially given the losses they incurred. Remember the 13th they get fucking hosed down in Safonovka, the 14th or vice versa, they went to Giri 13th and the 14th went to Safonovka. Those two ambushes cost them over 25 pieces of equipment. So, what the actual fuck is this logic about the raid? What would be the purpose? Like, was it going to be a feel-good situation when you lose the equipment worth of a fucking Ukrainian brigade and say, oh yeah, it's fine? So this mentality sold by Koffman, I don't get it. It lacks seriousness. Now, Russian forces continue to suffer from low force quality. Bitch, they kicked you out of Kursk by going through a fucking sewer for 15 kilometers. What the actual fucking thing does it say about your force quality? But also a general inability to overcome prepared defenses. They literally kicked you out of Kursk. In 3 days, they got you out of 250 square kilometers of territory you were holding for 7 months. You had all that time to prepare those fucking defensive lines. So how is that for a logic? The scale of attack, whether infantry, light motorized, or mechanized, or whatever, is typically insufficient to break through airfield positions. And I'm like, how? How did we got here? You just got kicked out of Kursk. And your guys are trying now to break through the fucking Belgrade Oblast border, losing at least 15 pieces of equipment the very first day, probably even more now. And they're making 600 meters advances and pullbacks. This is cretinism enshrined. And it's just hating for hating. Over the course of 2023-2024, Russian forces had adapted and finally assault groups and detachments, essentially majoring in the minors. These tactics yielded incremental gains, grinding through the front, but do not lead to operational civilian breakthroughs. Since Kursk, 4,000 square kilometers. Biggest gains since the liberation of Luganda in July 2022. As simple as that. You can discuss it, you can jump on your head. Ukrainians can only dream of 4,000 square kilometers in 7 months. There's nothing else to be said. And as for Ukrainians not crumbling, well, let's see how it goes. Let's see who is asking for a ceasefire here. Let's see who is hiding the impossibility to get people in sufficient quality and quantity to man new units and pretend that, oh, no, it's not because we want new units, but first we're gonna major in minors with the units we already have, therefore literally limiting the expansion of the Ukrainian armed forces. And initially, remember how it was? It was, oh, we don't have the equipment from the Western allies. And now, oh, we have enough equipment, but we don't have enough men. How come? And it's not just because everybody died. Let's be honest about that. But it's a multiple factor. We spoke about this multiple times. You have a Fox effect on the mobilization that is done, is happening because the guys at the front suffer a completely horrible attrition. If you go and check the latest Medusa article of what's going on in Ukraine, you're gonna smile. Just go and check it. He's some Spanish dude that went to Ukraine, and he had a metric ton of interviews. And well, just go and read it. Don't trust me. You should trust Infa, but don't trust me. And so we got this dude trying to sell us for some reason that actually Russians are stupid and they're unable to do anything. But yet at the same time, he cannot explain why Ukraine has a deficit of manpower, why Ukraine just got fucking kicked out of Kursk, after a long-term operation, once again, we should not just, fix ourselves the last week or so, especially while the Super Zero operation, once again, was perfect and led to a panic attack on the Ukrainian side. Remember, these guys are way better trained than the Russians. They panic only when they see sewers, because probably they do not have them in Ukraine or something like that. But how the fuck are you gonna speak about quality of troops over Russians being unable to break through lines and stuff like that? This is just mindless. This is trying to ignore the fucking gorilla in the fucking room. So let's wrap it up and then go to the next one, because that one you're gonna fucking laugh. Russian Federation has been dealing with a degree of material exhaustion after high loss rates in the fall, but current Russian Federation contract rates continue to provide replacement and enable rotations. Like, how the fuck does it even work? Russian recruitment went up considerably in the second half of 2024, and we literally had a Medusa analysis of that, pointing out that in fact, if we have to trust the new enticement contract and the incentives that are being given, the latest part of 2024 was literally half as successful as the earliest part in 2023 and late 2022. Once again, it's not that I believe Medusa. I think that Medusa made something. Actually, the guys who did this article for Medusa have it wrong, but it doesn't actually even matter. It's just to point out that Koffman is citing shit that makes no sense when you start reading specialized and specific information. The Russians are now recycling the pool of people they built up between 2023 and 2024, because despite the attrition affected the Ukrainians worse, and they are feeling it in the way how the combats are going. Remember, if we had to analyze Bakhmut, when Syrskyi launched his counteroffensive in Bakhmut, it literally ended up surviving most of Zaluzhny's gains in Zaporozhye. And that's the funny part. With Drapati, in 3 months we have nothing. And most of it is bullshit made up by Cope State. The bottom line is that despite the observed accelerated gains in the fall, the Russian military is visibly underperforming relative to its material advantages, and those gains were made at very high cost. Once again, no. The comparative costs between Russia and Ukraine for those gains is positive for Russia compared to how it was before. And the problem with that is, once again, because the Ukrainians were seeing the fucking writing on the wall over Pokrovsk with the force structure that they had, and they decided to go to Kursk because, I said once again, they thought they would better spend that equipment, those people, by frightening the Russians and pulling them away than fighting against them in Donetsk. This led to the fucking crumbling on multiple spots of the Ukrainian lines. So in fact, the Russians themselves did what they usually do. But it's the choices of the Ukrainian leadership that led to the fucking debacle in Ugledar, Velika Novosilka, and the Pokrovsk area. And we will not speak about Kupiansk or the beachheads beyond the Oskol River. Once again, I'm going to repeat, the biggest problem that Koffman has right now is to actually face the piper, tell the truth. The front line is not about to collapse, despite AFU being largely pressed out of Kursk. The overall situation from Pokrovsk to Kupiansk improved. This is not the case. Actually, the overall situation, especially in gains, was still negative for Ukraine, but it doesn't matter. We are speaking post-truth here. It's not as bad as it should have been. Yeah, the problem is that it's not like that because you just got kicked out of Kursk. So now those guys are gonna, you know, be transferred to kick your ass in Pokrovsk, and you are gonna restart the same fucking cycle. Ukraine still has a chance to stabilize the front, but I thought it was already stabilized. So what is this chance about stabilizing the front? If positive trends are sustained, what positive trends? The last 3 fucking weeks, you were at almost 14 assets lost per day. Uh, that means over 4,000 units of assets gonna be lost if that fucking trend continues. I do not think that's positive, quite the least. The problem is, once again, these people stopped being serious after 2022. And unfortunately, the culprit here is the Russian underperformance 2022. And the ignorance of the reversal of the trends has been very hard, and despite us pointing it out right off the bat, guys, you're gonna get bitch slapped. Nah, it's okay. UMPKs, look at the welds, they're not good enough. Optifiber, what is this? It's bullshit. Oh, Lancet, see, we have reduced the Lancet numbers at 23. You see the stats, Lancet are completely normal. Sure, we would like them to be at 600 per month, but it is what it is. So, generally speaking, Koffman here is literally shitting the bed. Based on pro-Ukrainian statistical evidence, Ukraine is underperforming gravely what they're doing. And of course, we had the your losses update, which put out missing in action. And then you start understanding what Ukraine is doing is lying. They are lying over their dead. They are lying over their losses. They are lying over the situation. They are lying over all the line. They are hiding their dead by considering them missing in action. Of course, it's a fig leaf. Everybody understands that. The dude who has been missing for 2 years is not going to come back alive because we have a different list for POWs within your losses. But once you start analyzing it from a logical perspective, you understand that right now Zelia is doing something that I think, in my opinion, is going to kill him at the end, which is trying to stall the truth for some kind of divine intervention, quote unquote, Western intervention to save his ass. And it's not saving his ass from getting killed. The Russians are not going to kill his ass. Russians are going to do something pretty simple. I said they're going to humiliate this motherfucking clown. They're going to force him to sign on that dotted line those 4 blasts out. And Putin might reuse the very unpleasant terminology he used the 8th of February 2022 when he had Macron next to him. Well, that you like it or not, you're going to take it. And that's what Zelia is there for. Putin ushered those words in 2022, and he wants Zelensky to literally suck a giant banana. I think the disgust and displeasure and enmity between Monkey and the cokehead has gone beyond personal. And the problem with that is because Ukrainians choose to actually try and humiliate Russia. And to be honest, that was a viable option for them if they believed that Russia would back off after getting a few slaps on its nose. But unfortunately, that part actually evolved into something worse, and this is where we come for the part two. So the problem with Ukrainian leadership is the delusion, and this delusion leads to a atrophy when it comes to planning and executing any kind of operation. There are many reasons why the Ukrainians are in that bad shape. A good bunch of them is that commanding officers have been literally decimated. And the problem is that in order to face that situation, and given the capability of the Russians to strike military academies, we had Desna twice. I mean, you understand what I mean. The officer corps can just not have the time to train new recruits. And on top of it, and that's the biggest problem, is that in order to train these new recruits, at least the officers, you need to pull current serving officers out. And Ukraine and Russia, but mostly Ukraine, have a huge issues with their officer corps. A lot of them, in my opinion, given some extremely amateurish mistakes that have been made all over the 3 years of war, indicate that these people are just not good enough at the task they're doing, or they do not have the head to do that stuff, or the guts, or whatever. And one of the examples is what's happening right now in Demidovka, in Belgorod Oblast. The attack on Demidovka is actually part of the Kursk operation. And it is the sister operation to the Kolotilovka attack, the 12th of August 2024, about a week after the start of the operation. You guys remember that the Ukrainians tried to force the Kolotilovka border checkpoint. They got fucked up. We had some very crazy footage with at least one Max Pro trying to force the obstacles at the border, ramming it up, then getting fucked up by the 155th and Ahmad, and ending with heads on a fucking pike, which, well, was dubbed a war crime. I don't know what it was exactly, but it was extremely important at that point. A lot of us in the group were asking what the fuck they're doing, it's too far. But at the same time, the Ukrainians were preparing for a push from Guevo, Plekovo to Giri. Now, between Giri and Kolotilovka, you have the current line of attack. And the attacking point gives way to a straight line road that goes 16 kilometers deep into Russian territory. So once you point it out and you see Kolotilovka working, quote unquote, going deep, Demidovo going deep, and Giri going deep, you can see that there is a huge swath of land, not that actually deep, it's still 15 kilometers, but compared to the 28 kilometers they maximally pushed, it's obvious that it would have been a significant buffer zone. By being that big, this also means that the bullshit that Ukrainians try to sell everybody after Korenovo failed, which is, we were surprised by the success of the operation. So what we did suddenly was to actually extend the scope of it and try to go as far as possible. Well, that's just not the truth. The logic is that we saw the attacks in Kolotilovka, and we see the sister attack, which was probably the end of the operational expansion, was supposed to join somewhere around Giri and then establish a defensive perimeter of, as I said, probably between 3.4 and 4,000 square kilometers. It would have been huge because that thing would have worked in about 12 to 15 days. They would have grabbed a humongous piece of land straight off the bat. And the situation that you saw that took 6 months, of 7 months actually, of grueling losses, of HIMARS strikes, of mad pushes in order to liberate, it would have taken probably over a year. And that would have been a bargain chip. Because, first of all, 4,000 square kilometers was already my idea if they had cut up north. But it never came because Tetkino was extremely problematic and these guys could not get over the same anyway. Because, well, you know, higher quality of troops and all that shit. It's sarcastic, by the way. But the push along the Belgorod Kursk Oblast, that's a better option because you can go fast. Most of your road there is covered by vegetation, so you can start hiding your shit and advance more properly. But the biggest issue with this situation is something else. That plan backfired, never worked properly, they got booed and kicked out. But the fact that they are resorting to a annex operation of the first push in order to, in my opinion, alleviate the pressure from the outgoing troops and the fact that the Russians are pursuing them. As I said, they are all into Basivka, they got Juravka and so on and so on. What's going on here is simply that they were so much into what can we do that they still decided to do that part the same way they actually prepared it. And there are so many common points with Vesteloa in September 2024. They did the same. It made no sense. They still went there, sacrificed 20 pieces of equipment, get their ass kicked, pulled back, and then they just kept going at that level. So the reality is that these guys are insane. The commanding officers there are insane because they are now going on with this. Okay, tactically and I think intellectually, the point is that we have these troops, we have this situation with the Sumy Oblast getting pushed back. So let's do something. And given that we have the plan, the troops, and it's not too far, that's going to alleviate. And that's something that Akan Spetsnaz said, that the guys who were pelting Guevo in the Guevo area with FPVs got pushed back in order to assist, given that it wasn't too far from the southern Kotel in Suja Sumi area. So once you see, you know, this parallel highway pushes, then you start to ask yourself, okay, then it made sense in a certain weird way, because, you know, a bigger perimeter would have required from them more assets and more people, which they had, actually, because they lost that many. But what now? it doesn't feel logical. It doesn't feel interesting. It feels forced. And the only thing that is going to survive from the situation is the way how people are going to mock the Ukrainians for this failure of a plan. And of course, you're not going to hear Koffman over this shit because, like, the dude just glazed a completely crazy situation just because, okay, Mu crops, Mu 2022. But it's there that you're understanding that the political and military leadership on the Ukrainian side is losing more than just a war. In my opinion, someone should say stop. And the problem is that the person who should have said stop, which was Biden before, is not there anymore. And Trump doesn't give a fuck. In a certain sense, I'm really having this idea that Trump wants to see the Ukraine completely crash out and burn because he thinks that then he can strong arm to a deal that Ukrainians politically can just not take. And Trump himself has this absolute demented idea that he thinks that he is going to force the Europeans to take the antithesis of what the current European Union is based upon, which is the Helsinki Charter, which is the fact that the borders are inviolable. But once again, this is bullshit. Of course, borders are crossed. Of course, even in international relations, war is a legal form. Okay, it has now been abhorred and frowned upon, but the reality is that there have still been wars even since the Charter of the United Nations has been put to light. So on that aspect, everybody who speaks about war of aggression and whatnot, it's nonsense. America's had 3 of those. Did the world stop? No, quite the contrary. Some fucking retards went out there yapping about how Americans were bad, but at the end, Americans did what they wanted to do. And this is the whole point that we're having here. This is why I'm having such a huge problem with Europeans keep going with this logic of, oh no, we are not going to tolerate, we're not going to abet, and we're not going to comply with whatever deal that sees Ukraine losing land and rights. And I'm like, who the fuck cares? At the end of the day, your problem would be the same. At the end of the day, America has decided not to support Ukraine because they made peace with a separate peace with the Russians. And Ukraine will have only 2 choices. First is an insurrection against the sugar daddy, or break up with the European nonsense with a risk of losing some kind of partnership and then get back to a more logical situation where they will need to count with Russia. The only thing that they didn't want to do, which is be subservient to Russian interests, being within the sphere of influence, they're going to have to deal with that. And in a certain sense, that's the only big victory that Monk is going to get out of this situation. Because for the rest, well, militarily, he will have to, lead this war to its current logical conclusion. And that means, unfortunately, a twice as big pile of cadavers before the Ukrainians get the point. And most importantly, even if they get the point, the Ukrainian society, even those that are apathetic right now, are going to have a huge problem accepting a Russian domination straightforward for one big reason. The level of sufferance they've had, despite Zelensky, despite the retards who promised them they're going to win and stuff like that, at the end of the day, the Russians killed their sons. The Russians burned their homes. The Russians destroyed their economy. So the whole, if we betray the Ukrainians, they're going to turn around and embrace the Russian world and then help them attack Europe is stupid. Because the biggest challenge for the Russians would be to pacify Ukraine in a sense that they wouldn't dare to dream about some round three. And given how the Ukrainian military is reacting right now, which is in some kind of frenzy, I do not think that it's a very good sign. I think that the only real solution for Monkey is to stall as much as he can the Orange Man and force a military decision. For instance, taking Pokrovsk or threatening the whole sister cities from very close. In this case, at least taking Konstantinovka. This is exactly where the problem is. And this is why a lot of people, instead of understanding how bad the general situation is for the Ukrainians, because it is bad. The Ukrainians are at the limit of what they can afford. They are at the limit of what they can afford. If for some reason the Russians lose it and go ham on them, well, it's game over, as simple as that. And we are seeing it. For a long while, as I told you, we were not seeing the results of the Russian strikes on Ukraine. People were not filming, or the results were not that good. But now, with the Russians literally showing us first-person evasion and attack on Ukrainian objectives, Ukrainians from the ground themselves, from different cities, filming the hits from the Russians, you start understanding the problem. Both sides have decided to play this long-range game, but only one side can drop to your face between 90 and 900 kilograms of payload. The other side is going to try and strap 300 maybe on a civilian light plane, and that's it. Of course, we should not laugh because we should not do what they did when it came to the UMPK's faulty welds and all that shit. But right now, despite all the bravado, despite the super long range Neptune, all that shit, we are still well into the heavy long-range drone territory between 20 and 50 kilos worth of charge, and hitting mostly opportunistic targets, thanks to, of course, the intelligence informations passed through by NATO and especially the US. So that's it. It is that simple. The Ukrainians are going slowly to the realization that the only thing that they can do is make any kind of negotiation between orangutan and monkey expensive to the point where nobody can afford that piece. And making it expensive means, for instance, keep going with his fucking Belgorod adventures, making Monkey and the other gorillas mad and start losing pieces from Oblast they weren't on the menu at all. And once again, Russians are 4.7 and 6 kilometers from Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. if there is a point to be made, they will make it. And that's the problem here. Because right now, what the Ukrainian leadership and the Ukrainians generally are thinking is that the Russians will not do. They will not go up to there. Ukrainians can do what they want. They do not care because in their head is that we're the underdogs. We can afford that. Morally, economically, whatever. The problem is that it doesn't work like that in real life. As I said, at some point, things are going to turn awry for the Ukrainians and shit is going to be to die for. And that's what it is. Right now, that's what it is. They are frying a megaton of assets in an attempt to stall the Russians. It's not working. They are losing a ton of people and hiding it under missing in action bullshit. And we keep going like this non-stop, and it's gonna go from bad to worse. There are also, as I said, monetary issues to why you would hide those people, because if you are at 5,000 guys killed per month, the costs, especially that they voted the new golden casket at over $500,000 per person, the costs are gonna fucking skyrocket because this year was an extremely big negative year for them generally. And I said, on one side you had the deserters, on the other side you had the people who avoid the draft dodgers, and on the other side you had the actual losses, which are staggering. And therefore, the problems that we're going to have going forward with the Ukrainians is that there is no actual tripwire for them. Like for Engels, if they can do it, they will do it. Never mind what the consequences will be. The point now is just a performative action to annoy the Russians, to humiliate them, to shame them. And it doesn't matter if, for some reason, the backfire means that half of a city is gone. As for now, the third part, I will briefly touch upon the negotiations. Right now, the content of whatever was negotiated, except for the commonality, so basically Putin had topically agreed into a ceasefire over energy installations, and of course we know that's not true because they went and absolutely fried Kirovograd, then attacked Sumy, then today they're fucking over Odessa. It's a game that both sides are gonna play. The small cokehead wanted to placate Russia and make it look like they would be the bad guys not agreeing to peace. Monkey, as I said to you guys, started to line up a fuck ton of reason of why he shouldn't do it. But you know what? We're still gonna agree for something that right now doesn't advantage anyone. Because in a certain sense, Russians not hitting Ukraine from the air doesn't do anything for the Russians. Because that also includes ballistic missiles within Ukraine. And the whole point with the ballistic missiles has been high value targets. Sometimes it has been also power plants and stuff like that, but most of the time it has been military related targets. So halting those strikes is problematic. Then as a second step, halting the attacks on the on the Black Sea. Who the fuck actually cares? The Russians are literally the only one to benefit from it if you start excluding Iskanders. But as I said, if it's only for energetical targets, then you're going to have a problem, of course, because Russia can perfectly start using the dual-use lingo. And most of the times we have seen that Ukrainians have militarized civilian or non-military, directly non-military premises. Therefore, for all the people who actually mocked Monkey and pretended it was washed and all that shit, the whole point of him being him was how we returned the narrative that was coming from the West on how the Russians were with their backs on the wall, that they needed to yield it. I told you that it was the easiest thing ever for a seasoned politician to fucking revert that situation. And him apparently having a good relationship with Orange Time, he literally made him feel that he wanted to do something. At the same time, he said to the other party that he wouldn't do it unless this was done. So basically laid out a series of preconditions that made it absolutely unpalatable to the Ukrainians. However, by being positive, by being diplomatic, he also accelerated the belief on the Trump administration that he wanted actually peace. What Putin wants is to end the war on his terms. That could be called as peace. But so far, every time that Zelensky has come with an idea to put the Russians into the red corner, Russians have completely bamboozled Trump. And that's that. These are the problems of the negotiations right now. They are meaningless because both sides have red lines, quote unquote, and those red lines are simply incompatible. Zelensky says he will never recognize the loss of territory. Problem is, nobody cares what he says. Although it's very important because Ukraine needs to, sign the send-off or of the occupied and annexed oblasts. But this is, once again, why Zelensky has lost control over the situation politically. His humiliation at the White House was one aside to behold, but his attempt to save it somehow with the help of the French and the Brits just made him look even stupider. Because the whole point was not to engage in bargaining. You are Ukrainian. That's your land. You cannot start having a bargaining. Because at the end, you're going to have to leave something on the table. And it doesn't matter if it's a big thing or a small thing. Once you open the door, it's not up to you to decide anymore. And that's the problem that I have with the Ukrainian leadership right now. Slowly, they went down from their horses. Let's remember, these guys pompously signed the document to join the EU and NATO. Okay, the request from inside. I'm not saying that they were over the map or whatever. And suddenly that's it. Suddenly everybody's telling them, everybody that counts of course, that NATO is out of question, that they should prepare, especially the Americans telling them that they should prepare for territorial concessions. But of course, what does it mean? Is it 1 square kilometer? Is it the 4 oblasts? Is it something else? And then we hear voices and noises from the Americans saying a neutral possession and control of the Zaporizhia NPP. I'm like, okay, for sure as hell, this is not going to be accepted. That's what exactly Zelensky said. It's ours and you're not going to get it. But the problem is that this asshole wants a mineral deal while he doesn't have minerals. And as our friend Chinez said, the only thing that they can have in order to fill up this common pot will be to sell literally energy. And in order to do that, either they give it to the Americans under control, either they get it themselves. But in order for the Americans to reap some benefits, well, There are not many ways. So, yeah, actually, Zelensky from the beginning opened his mouth, put his both feet, shoveled them pretty hard, and then now everybody wants to believe that Zelensky is this guy who knows everything, controls everything. He has made amateur mistakes, talking to Trump about the mineral deal, refusing it, then being a retard trying to review the deal at the Ukraine's advantage. When you read the understanding document, the MOU, you literally ask yourself, Trump cannot be this stupid because it's literally nothing. And especially if the joint fund is going to be 50-50 and Ukraine cannot be taxed or forced to pay out of its current fiscal revenues, then where are they going to find the money? Because if we're speaking about exports, and there is this talk about 350 billion, 500 billion, so Ukraine just doesn't have them. So once again, we go back to this fucking vicious circle of Ukrainians treating everything like some kind of hustle. And the problem with that is that once you start hustling that hard, people just don't like you anymore. On top of it, Trump has personal business with Ukrainians, and of course with the way Zelensky went about when there was the presidential campaign. And Zelensky has been a serial gaffer when it came to his relationship with Trump. And therefore, the whole situation, when it blew up at the end of February, was the apotheosis of how Zelensky is an utter muppet and doesn't seem to read the fucking room. And on top of it, the Ukrainians are defending him. I mean, his political circle, are defending him despite completely overlooking that they're alive because of America. And the guy who is in charge of keeping them alive is an absolute moron, which cannot understand. I'm oversimplifying. Trump is not like this basic retard, but simply has these very primal instincts, especially when it comes to the whole logic of making deals, making money, taking advantage of such a situation. And, well, that's it. That was the space. First we started with Koffman absolutely ridiculing himself and saying shit that based on data, hard data, territorial changes, timetable, proven losses, makes no sense. Second part, we see that unfortunately the Ukrainians are in this zugzwang where choices that they've made over time are now coming back home to roost, and the only choice they have is to go deeper in the insanity. Demidovka is exactly that example. And finally, when it comes to the negotiation, the problem is that Zelensky is missing the thing that technically should have been his forte, which is interpersonal relationship. And on top of it, because he's such a ridiculous man on many points, he starts to believe in his own con that somehow it's him and it's Ukraine managing to hold off the Russians. The problem, I'm going to repeat, is not that Ukrainians are not dying and fighting, is that they cannot do what they're doing right now without a massive influx of intelligence, means, supplies, and money from the West. So the sooner the Ukrainians realize they're puppets, and a lot of them are realizing that simply there is a status quo system there, the sooner we might have some kind of mutiny within the armed forces or within society. If you go and check the Telegram page of the Coordination Center for Prisoners of War and others on the Ukrainian side, every single fucking day, the Coordination Center is trying to placate wives, sisters, and mothers of missing in action or killed and in other situations with the Ukrainian armed forces. That thing is the evidence on how bad the things are and why at least there the Ukrainian government is doing its utmost, even if they have to say bullshit, because sometimes they just don't know where the people are. They know more or less where they went, where they disappeared. They probably also have footage of one or the other groups getting absolutely mowed down by the Russians. For instance, they literally had the gall to show the picture of the dead grown-ups in Kursk. That's how a mother recognized her son via the underwear. Anyway, very sad story. But this is them. This is Ukraine. I always said it. It's a worse version of Russia without anything that makes Russia the way Russia is. And the only thing that Ukrainians have for that, unfortunately, is this post-truth logic, but also a lot of jealousy. And unfortunately, it gets passed for some kind of irredentism towards Russian oppression, but in reality, it's just a provincial mentality of people who think they're smarter. In a certain case, we have that sometimes the Balkans as well, where smaller countries think that we're smarter, which sometimes is true actually, because the bigger you are, the more morons you're gonna have within your population. But it's also the contrary. The bigger you are, the more smarter people you're gonna have. And of course, the critical mass makes it that even if it's a moron in power, think of Trump, you're gonna have to admit they're smarter in case you don't want to get crushed. And Ukraine, for some reason, is ready to go and die nationally instead of admitting its post-racist position within its own geography, actually. So that was it, guys. It's a bit late, so I'm not going to take any Q&M, but this weekend we're going to do it for real, especially after the suspension. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening, and we see each other probably on Saturday. Bye-bye.